back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell. I'm the host of Finding Our Future. Okay, that's what it is. We're talking about the future today, even on Columbus Day. I continue to call it Columbus Day, just the way I continue to call that big store Liberty House, and I call 6th Avenue 6th Avenue, too. I live in the past. That's why this is such a contention. The future and the past.
I can feel it already.
We have to learn from the past to figure out what the future holds, right?
Absolutely.
There you go.
Right.
And I minored in American history. Watch out. History being the operative term. Okay, that's John A. Sweeney, PhD candidate in political science at UH Manoa. He is a researcher at the Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies, HRCFS, which actually gets the award of the day for acronyms, don't you think? And my co-host, Nicole Hori.
Hello.
Thanks for coming down. Nicole, before we get to the substance, can you report a little bit on what you've been doing this afternoon? You went down to a hearing in the state legislature. What was that?
Right. We went, the room was absolutely packed. They had to, set up cameras for overflow outside. And everyone was there to hear the presentations by HECO and by the solar energy associations, as well as visiting a speaker from the mainland who I believe is funded by the Department of Energy and has worked in different areas, not just Hawaii. And basically, everyone was trying to share their opinions on the rules that changed on September 6th.
And the tax office rules.
No. These are rules determining whether you can make a connection to the grid with a new solar energy system. Good. So definitely part of Hawaii's future.
The interconnect rules.
It was neat to hear the most recent numbers. They're saying Hawaii's at 9%, which is far beyond any other state. So I know we're having a lot of trouble with the current working out the details and the installations right now, but it's still good that we have a lot of renewable energy, and I think that's still going to be the case going forward, even though there's some hiccups along the way.
So who spoke? Who testified? Just in general.
Well, let's see. So there were actually 4 committees. It was between the Senate and the House, and so we had energy and environment, and also consumer protection agencies. And then testifying for HECO, we had Scott Sue and Colton.
I'm
not sure his last name.
Colton was there. Okay.
Yeah, and then there was also our recent moderator, Linda.
Leslie.
Yes.
Cole Brooks.
That's right.
From the Hawaii Solar Energy Association. She also spoke. Okay. What was the upside? Any upside? Any result?
Mark Duda. Well, I think people had different suggestions for how they could deal with this. Looking at the different islands, some of them are requiring that the utility provide approval in advance, rather than the current system on Oahu, in which case you go through the building process and they sign off that your installed system meets the requirements, and then you go to HECO for approval with the net metering application.
Disappointed about that.
It would be very disappointing if it didn't go through, or if you had to pay thousands of dollars to have studies done, or had delays associated with that prevented you from using your system right away. So
was there any discussion of legislation that might come up?
Well, I think there were certainly expectations from the legislators about the information that the public needs to receive about this situation, and I think that was directed at all of the people testifying, basically, that they want to make sure that whatever customers as customers are going through the process, that they're kept informed and they have an idea of what to expect, so there's no surprises along the way.
Okay, and we have footage of this.
Yes.
All of this, and we will make a show out of it. We'll play it right here on ThinkTech, and we'll broadcast it within the next couple of days is what we'll do. Thank you very much for going down there, Nicole.
Oh, it was fun.
Well, on to our main discussion, So tell me, what is the concept of futurism? In my favorite acronym, the Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies. Futures Studies, right?
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up futurism because that's not what we do.
We want to define it. So the first thing you do is define what is not included, right?
Absolutely. I
knew that.
We often get confused with the 20th century art movement, which was actually entitled futurism, right? So we're not Italian artists trying to recreate a particular ideology or a fascist. What we do is we take the uncertainty, the possibility, the potentiality of the future seriously. So what that means is the S on future studies for us is critical. The future for us is a plural. It's a verb. It's not a static thing. It's dynamic. It's changing. It's shifting. And fundamentally, we believe the future doesn't exist. And if the future doesn't exist, what we're known for are the forecasting of alternative futures. So as we were saying before we came on, I promise, and I was hoping there'd be no talk of crystal balls. We don't do prediction. We take qualitative, quantitative data, and we look at and model what we call images of the future. And we're known for creating scenarios that hopefully are far enough out to impact planning and policy. So we try to have a definite policy interface. We are in the Department of Political Science, and we take seriously questions that I think are very prescient relative to uncertainty, certainly with energy issues, climate change. We simply feel like we're living in what is often called post-normal times. So how do we deal with that post-normality? We try to confront it by looking at multiplicities and then planning accordingly.
Okay, we're going to drill down on that.
Okay.
Nicole and I are ready.
So just going back to your climate change example, if you have a range of temperatures that we might reasonably expect, is that what you mean by a multiplicity of futures?
Right.
Things that are possible?
Right, absolutely. So anytime we do futures, we want to delineate between the possible, the probable, the plausible, and the preferable. I realize that's a mouthful.
It's the 4 Ps.
The 4 Ps, as I like to call them, as I tell my students. But fundamentally, it's exactly what Nicole is saying. Like, we would look at those potentialities. Now, IPCC has been doing this for a while.
Right.
Recent reports have come out, right, with UH scientists saying in the 2040s, we could see a massive shift in the climate. And I want to be clear, right? Climate's obviously different from weather. We're talking about, like a more, impactful type of shift. So what we try to do is to make that digestible for people. By creating a variety of interfaces. Some of those are experiential, some are more textual, highly visual, because from our perspective, it's not enough just to think about these numbers. People have to feel those changes if we're going to work towards, again, not just structural solutions, but value-based and behavioral solutions in the present to create the kind of future that we'd like to see come into existence.
Yeah, there's no other futures studies organization at any campus?
We are the only PhD program in the U.S. where you can focus on alternative futures. There are lots of future studies programs in Europe and Asia. Taiwan has a very good program.
Are they governed by the same concept?
Yeah, absolutely. Future Studies was actually in some ways founded by our advisor, Dr. Jim Dater, who taught the first futures, college-level futures class at Virginia Tech back in the 1970s. So as an academic discipline, we've been around for a while, and the center has actually been housed at UH since 1971. So we've been around the block for a bit. Clearly, I haven't been there since 1971, but.
Do you mind if we drill down a little more on all of that?
Sure.
So it seems, you say there's no crystal ball, and yet you're going to give us a range of possibilities. So it's like maybe an unfocused crystal ball, but it's still a crystal ball. You're looking into the future and telling us what's likely or not so likely to happen.
Right.
Then we're just counting angels on the head of a pin when we say, well, it's not a crystal ball, it's like a crystal ball.
Right. Well, Guy Hoggy goes on TV every day and tells people what the surf report might be, or that there's an 80% chance of Malka showers, right?
Do you know more about it than he does?
Well, he always says likely, right? So it is likely that this might happen. He will never definitely say this is what's going to happen, right?
Nobody smart will ever.
Precisely. So we try to, again, get around that, and we affirm up front. So when we deal with clients, when we consult, and we do that with nonprofits, governments, we also have a range of other clients, individuals, community organizations, that we make it clear we're not here to predict. No one can predict the future. If someone is, they're selling you snake oil.
Multiple futures.
Precisely. So you give a range of possible futures, alternative scenarios, as we call them.
The PPPPP?
Right.
What is that? Possible, plausible,
probable, and preferable.
Probable and preferable. Boy, that is I'd like to get the definition, the dictionary definitions of each of those and
Sure.
see, assign numbers to them in terms of certainty.
Right.
But anyway, so you put numbers on, the likelihood that a given scenario will be the one that actually happens.
We're famous, or the Manoa School as we're called, is famous for coming up with and utilizing what we call 4 generic forms. So since...
Always 4.
Well, those are 4 archetypes. So for example, if I were to sit down and imagine what the future might be, I might come up with thousands of, quote, images of the future. So what the 4 futures does is it gives you a means to categorize them loosely but yet broadly enough where you can apply and manipulate the content. So for
So
example,
you put them in 4 categories.
4 major categories.
Sort of like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Precisely, except some are better than others. But you actually speak to a good point. We avoid dystopias. We also avoid utopias.
Dystopia? Tell the people what that is.
Dystopia, literally a bad place in Greek. And the exact opposite of that in Greek is the utopia, literally no place. Now, no place means it was a place so perfect, the Greeks actually thought it couldn't exist. We try to hit for the sweet spot, which is an E-utopia. That is a preferable place. It's not a perfect place. It means it has both challenges and opportunities.
That cataclysm can't happen? I mean, that the apocalypse can never happen?
Cataclysm, but we always have to ask for whom, right? So for example, if we look at the government shutdown, clearly it's impacting a variety of different peoples, but not everyone in the same way. Now there are obviously cataclysmic events, right? Just ask the dinosaurs. But fundamentally, if you look at how humanity has been able to survive, we've been able to navigate those changes. And the data likes to say a big part of what we do is helping people, organizations, whomever, learn how to surf tsunamis. And I think certainly recently that's become a good way of putting it.
Another element is if we have a really bad time, what you call dystopia,
Right.
we won't even know about it.
Well, some
We
argue
won't care.
we're living in a dystopia now.
Really?
Sure.
Oh, I would have thought of dystopia. Don't you think, Nicole? But dystopia is a lot worse than what we have now.
Well, it has everything to do with perspective, and that's the point, is that in any given scenario, in every given future, there are a variety of what we call subject positions, which means that power is never homogeneous. It's always broken up. Where there's power, there's always resistance. And we try to bring those voices into the present to help people think critically about those possibilities.
Okay, so, but 4. You always kind of try to make 4
Right.
scenarios to compare and contrast.
Well, let me
it
just-
reminds me of how I give speeches. I'll tell you how I give speeches. And I learned this a long time ago. On national TV, I learned this. I always divide my material into 5 parts. Why? Because I have 5 fingers, am I right? And as I go through the parts, I bend a finger each time. And when I get to the bend the last finger, I'm finished. That's why. Now, why 4?
Why 4? Well, the 4 actually help us understand the trajectory that most people feel like we're headed towards. So for example, it's really hard to find an organization, a government, anyone that isn't and doesn't think that growth is the future. We live in a world predominantly that thinks that, guess what, tomorrow will be an extended version of today, right? So that is one of
We
our
don't
futures.
necessarily accept that.
Well, we don't think that while that is certainly possible and highly probable, it is not the only
You
sort
can't
of-
make the assumption,
Precisely.
a sort of global
Precisely.
assumption always be better.
Right. And it's-
especially now.
Right, and it's not always preferable, right? Certainly I think the discourse on sustainability has led people to think about one of the other archetypes, which is a discipline scenario. Now discipline can be very authoritarian, but can also be more egalitarian, but it's the sustainability conversation, right? How do we limit or constrain the rampant growth? Because growth always brings with it externalized costs, right? Now, this is where things get interesting. If we don't get discipline and growth goes rampant, it might lead us to a collapse. And a collapse is the dystopia, the cataclysmic
Right.
apocalypse scenario you were
So-
talking about.
How are we doing so far? Are you getting a headache? What do you make of this so far? Can we take a break? And before we take the break, I just want to do a little wrapper on it. What do you think?
Well, I'm really curious where this is having an impact and what organizations or politicians and what people are looking at this
Okay, that's a
to
great
determine their
question.
actions.
Okay, we're going to tackle that one. Are you ready for it?
Ready.
I know he's ready. He's ready. I've seen him before. He's ready. Trust me. Okay, this is ThinkTech. We're doing Monday. We're doing Finding Our Future, which is a multiple compound kind of way of looking at things, with John A. Sweeney, PhD candidate, political science at UH Manoa. He's a researcher at the HRCFS, which is the Hawaii, you call it that?
Never called it that, but I like it.
The Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies. We'll be right back after this break.
I'm Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the 4th Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
We're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell here at ThinkTech on a Monday with John A. Sweeney, a PhD candidate in political science at UH Manoa and a researcher in the Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies, and my co-host, Nicole Hori. How we doing?
Doing good.
Okay, you left a question hanging before the break, and I think it's time to look at that. It's a question that actually hangs over everything here today,
Right.
and that is, why do I care?
Right.
Why does the government care? What effect are your research studies having on the people who could actually deal with these changes and scenarios?
Right. So to speak directly to Nicole's question, two of the largest purveyors of future studies and foresight, or strategic foresight as it's often called, are the military and multinational corporations. Now why? Well, both those are invested in protecting a certain kind of future, right? In trying to create a certain kind of future. So if you look back historically, future studies was birthed with places like the Rand Corporation, Shell originated scenarios and modeling scenarios. And so strategic foresight has often been integrated into business practices, long-range planning.
Sure, before it was ever called futures studies.
Precisely, but that's where we differ, because we take a truly alternative approach. In other words, we set those four futures, and the last one was transformational, and as I like to say, that's the angels or aliens scenario, radical change. So we take all those four and we place them horizontally, which is to say we take each one and we look at them equally. Now, a lot of other organizations might say, well, let's focus on the growth and then sort of go from there and build our preferred. But we firmly believe that unless people experience all four and think critically about all four and about the challenges and opportunities in each one, right, then there's really no way to say you want to move towards X as a future or to determine your preferred future unless you've genuinely experienced all of those alternatives.
You know what we haven't talked about? The horizon. Are we talking about 6 months here? Are we talking about any defined period of time? Don't you think we need to?
Absolutely. We don't typically come up with firm dates. We definitely utilize a time horizon that extends beyond standard planning and policy. So for us, if we're dealing less than 25 to 30 years, we're too close to the present. Now, with that being said, if you look at the accelerating rate of change, change happens so fast now, it's so complex, it's so dynamic, that changes that maybe in a previous generation took a lifetime will happen within a few months. And certainly, since we see technology as one of the main drivers of change, we think that you have to be firmly attuned to things coming down the pipe. So we look not only at trends, but what we call emerging issues. Some people call them wild cards, some people call them, black swans. But we think if you're attuned and you have, your finger on the pulse of what's going on, you can try to catch things before they sort of, blow up and become significant trends. But also sometimes emerging issues will disrupt trends as well.
Well, I see it almost as a matrix, that what you're talking about. So you have I'm making a box with four columns. That's 4 columns, right? Yeah, 4 columns. Okay, and there's 6 months, there's 2 years, there's 5 years, there's 10 years.
Right.
Okay, so aren't you doing that? Aren't you filling in the boxes on the matrix? I mean, if I was government, if I was industry, I would like to see a box like that. That would help me.
Right.
And I would say, well, I'm not too concerned about what happens there, but I am about what happens here. And I do favor, in my own mind, I do favor this scenario. So let's see what John A. Sweeney is saying about this scenario,
The only issue with working forward is that you always fall upon your own biases and sort of perceptions. Whereas what we often do with clients is called backcasting. You start in the future and you work your way backwards. And that's very helpful if you're trying to work towards a preferred future, specifically if you're able to institutionalize foresight. Because chances are, if you're doing forecasting once, and talking about how this happens locally, we actually did a project with the State Office of Planning where we created 4 different scenarios, we ran people through it, and a piece of climate change legislation actually came out of this, and this was in 2011. So this actually has praxis sort of associated with it.
Nothing has happened with that actual bill.
Well, that's where we, again,
you're out of it now. You did your thing,
once we've done our job, the last thing we want to be is responsible for how it's adopted.
This is the legislation that said whatever you do, you have to build in the possibility of climate change in every project.
Precisely.
Every project over which the state has any control or jurisdiction have to build it in. It was a noble thought.
Right.
Very hard to implement a bill like that.
It is, but the director of the State Office of Planning, Jesse Suki, received his master's degree in alternative futures in our program. He also obviously has a law degree as well. So
he's in the right place.
He's
in the
hip to
Office of
this,
Planning,
right? And that's just it. Our program has been so influential, and people have gone off. And since Jim Dater's been there for 40 years, it's diffused across the state in I think really unique and interesting ways.
If he's been studying Jim Dater, a word on Jim Dater, he is the name. it's interesting, Dator, D-A-T-O-R. He's been studying futures for 40 years, looking, ahead for 40 years. Has he been vindicated? Has he been confirmed? Do the thoughts that he had 40 years ago, have they come true in any way? Or is he completely frustrated?
Or have they been refined in that
Right,
amount of time?
right.
I assume things would have changed.
I think that's speaking to Nicole's point, it's a constant process. We have a very active listserv where we have ongoing discussions, and there have been moments, for example, where we have felt justified. I mean, we don't always try to be in a place where we can say, I told you so, but it does happen. So for example, our department and programs before my time was heavily invested in the Hawaii 2050 project, which was a huge statewide campaign. And so back in 2005, one of their futures had a corporation running as the governor. In fact, two corporations running against each other
In
for the
2050.
governorship in 2050. Now, if you step back from that
Corporation
future,
is a person too. This is
Precisely.
actually a little piece that was announced by the United States Supreme Court in Citizens United.
Right. And what year did they
which was
announce
a
that?
terrible case.
and they announced that in 2000,
about 5 years ago.
2010.
Yeah.
So that came up in 2005 as one of the scenarios. So that would be an example of applied foresight. We're able to show how an incremental step like the Citizens United ruling, which gives essentially or equates money with free speech, allows corporations to have the kind of personhood and protection of rights that other individuals might, which
So
could
did
very
this
well
fall
be the
into your
first step.
dystopia category, or?
Well, there is often the idea that while we take alternative futures seriously, the quote future of the future for many people tends to be the growth scenario. So the growth is the starting point, because let's be honest, if we're all not invested in doing things to have happy, wonderful, lovely lives right down the road, then what are we doing here? And yet, again, we try to take those seriously, but to challenge people to think critically about what are the externalized costs of growth? Growth for whom, right? Growth how, in what kinds of ways? And certainly the discourse on sustainability, and then hearing Nicole's
This
report
is
about
really,
energy today.
it's great commentary, it's great analysis of multiple. I was going to say, you wouldn't know exactly what the newscaster is going to say, because he's presumably in touch with the experts, and so you have to bring in all these other disciplines in order to make something of it. So that's why I want to ask you some free association questions.
Free association, okay?
Yeah, okay? I'll just give a term,
Okay.
and you give me a free association answer.
Okay.
In your discipline,
Sure.
in your kind of analysis, sustainability.
Resilience.
No, give me more than one word.
More than one word. Okay. My research looks specifically at the transition from global warming to global weirding. So from my perspective, in many cases, sustainability doesn't go far enough. What we need to inculcate is resilience. And resilience takes seriously not these sort of green growth models and the kind of greenwashing you see, I think, in many places, certainly in the US, but how do we think critically about building people's resilience within complex adaptive systems? I mean, how do we give people the tools necessary to survive what is certainly to be an uncertain future, right? Now, while we don't obviously put all of our eggs in one basket when it comes to the future, it's really hard to ignore the climate change predictions. Now, with that being said, we may be in a position where actually we'll double down. What I mean by double down is precisely my point about global weirding. Geoengineering becomes a very real possibility when you're talking about upwards of 5 to 7 million people being at risk. And certainly with the movement towards cities and the growth in the Asia-Pacific region, the potentiality for, let's say, large-scale climate mitigation efforts to maybe deploy a solar shield, which blocks some of the radiation to not allow the Earth, right? Now you think this might seem sort of like science fiction, but it's becoming science figuring it out.
But that's
And-
why I use the term weirding, because it could be anything.
Precisely. Well, the idea of the post-normal, like our idea of what is normal has just been weirded, right? We're living at a point where things that seemed like science fiction are now becoming more and
Yeah,
more
weird
real.
happens every day.
Sure.
And my next question, my next free association word is Congress.
Congress. Well, I will say that even though I'm a futurist, I also teach political science classes, and I'm teaching American politics this semester, which has been a fantastic but also a horrible time to be teaching American politics. If you look at Congress and how the government's set up, I mean, with this sort of Madisonian framework, our government is in some ways made not to work. legislation is supposed to be hard. The whole reason we have checks and balances, the three branches, is to create a system whereby it's difficult, unless one party is able to, completely take over, to have this sort of happen. I will say, obviously, with today, that my one-word free association would be gridlock. That fundamentally, with things like the supermajority and the movement towards a very clearly divisive, political landscape, that it's now, I think, become the worst case scenario. And obviously with...
Would you have anticipated this? Would this have been in a planning scenario?
Jim has a very popular paper called The Unholy Trinity, and the Unholy Trinity plus one. And it talks about peak oil, climate change, so and so. The plus one is lack of foresight in governance. And if you look at what's happening in Congress now, I would say a lack of foresight is what is destroying, in many ways, the fabric of that branch.
It's a good thing this doesn't happen in the state. Never mind. I got an email today about this whole matter. That's why I asked that question. And the story is that there's a terrible traffic jam in the Beltway. Everybody's locked up. And there's a man going from car to car. And he's going to each driver and he's telling them that there's been a kidnapping. All of Congress has been kidnapped. And they're holding them for $100 billion ransom. And he is asking people, to contribute. I think I messed this up already. And he says, the guy in the car says, how much is the average contribution? And fellow says, I messed this up so badly. It's something about it. He's not contributing money, he's contributing gasoline. Oh yeah, the threat is that they're going to burn Congress they're going to pour gasoline on Congress if the $100 billion doesn't come clear. Okay, and they're going to burn them all up, okay, with the gasoline. And how much are people contributing? And the guy says, well, about a gallon.
Right.
Okay, we got it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so moving on to another word. What about water? Does water do anything for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the critical issues in thinking about the future is freshwater access, right? We obviously live in a very fragile but also a furious sort of water cycle system. I mean, since we live on a closed system, right, there's a finite amount of water. Access and resources are key. Now, major multinational corporations like Coke have been going around buying up water rights. If you look at things like, for example, the cyclone that's hitting off India, strengthened, it's one of the fastest strengthening cyclones in history. I mean, what we're seeing is massive shifts within the water cycle that obviously have very much to do with climatic shifts. But I would also say, because I've been researching this, there are 42 countries that have active weather modification projects. Cloud seeding has become huge in China as a means of artificially creating rain. They're doing this in Abu Dhabi as well. They spent $11 million.
This is recently.
This is
happening now.
Right, yeah, to ionize the air when the ambient humidity reaches a certain threshold to allow them to create clouds, and they apparently created 55 days of extra rain. So if you look at
that, draw the rain off from somewhere else.
Well, that's just it. If we're talking about a closed system, if they're creating rain, it's not going somewhere else. And there is no international regulatory governance framework that is anything beyond a paper tiger to deal with this. So one of the concerns of geoengineering and things like water is, what if you have a unilateral actant decide they want to do X, and this has global consequences? And we're potentially looking down the barrel of that in the very near future, if not something like that's already happening right now.
So you're a PhD candidate, presumably researching something for your PhD.
Yes.
And we're going to take a very short break now. When we come back, we want to find out what you're researching.
Great.
And we want to explore that, okay? Right?
Yes.
Okay, that's John A. Sweeney, PhD candidate, I just mentioned, in political science at UH Manoa in the Futures Studies program. Okay, Nicole, Hori, and me were examining him, testing his futures, technique. We'll be right back after this break.
Hi, I'm Steve Petranek, editor of Hawaii Business Magazine, and I'm going to be part of Newsmorphosis 3, a look at online news in Hawaii. And along with me there will be Patty Epler of Civil Beat and HuffPost Hawaii, Malia Zimmerman of Hawaii Reporter, Jared Kuroiwa of KHON, and moderating us all is Howard Dykes of Hawaii News Now. If you want to know how Hawaii it gets its news now and will be getting it in the future, you need to be at Newsmorphosis 3. That's at 11:30 on October 24th at the Plaza Club. See you then.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech talk shows. If you didn't know it, ThinkTech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on ustream.tv. Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on ThinkTech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
Back, we're live. I'm Jay Fidell. I'm here with Nicole Hori, my co-host, and we are talking to John Sweeney, PhD candidate in political science at UH Manoa, a researcher in the Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies, which we intend to talk to a lot.
Great.
Hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
Because we want to get a handle on what's going on.
The last thing you should do is talk to me only. There are amazing people there doing fantastic research, and we're going to filter in some of those folks over
Okay.
here. So.
And a point during the break, which I think you were resonant on, is that there was a time when people did philosophically consider what would happen in the future.
Right.
And in some ways, we talked about the legislature, the Congress that thinks short term because it's, for most people, it's a 2-year cycle, and
Sure.
after the 2 years, you don't care. So you don't think beyond that boundary.
Right.
So I think people in general are thinking in short-term cycles. They don't think long-term. And this is hard to plan, it's hard to govern, So you guys fill a gap. There's a vacuum, and you guys are filling it, which is a good thing, and there ought to be more of you. And we ought to examine you more, too. Anyway, speaking of that, what exactly are you researching in your PhD research? What's your dissertation about?
Well, my dissertation looks at alternative futures for this concept of global weirding. And by global weirding, it's precisely...
Is that the term that you use?
That's the term that it's not my term. Technically, the term was coined by Hunter Levins of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and then popularized by Thomas Friedman, the precocious New York Times reporter that he is. And how I've reappropriated it is by looking at 3 major trends/emerging issues. So the one is geoengineering, the idea that there's no way we're going to wait for things to get that bad. People are going to act and try to manipulate the global climate system. So that's one. The other is bioengineering, and that covers everything from obviously GMOs, but also what some people have suggested, and while it's just a thought experiment, some people might be thinking it's real, is to increase empathy within people, or to create a pharmacological intolerance for carbon-intensive products like meat, to literally bioengineer beings such that they're more adaptable on a climate.
Except on Kauai.
Precisely. Probably not on Kauai. Probably not going to go over very well, right? But if you look at the kinds of things, and this is one of the big questions of this weirding, is weirding for whom and weirding for how? I mean, if you look at what the native Hawaiians did in Hawaii with the Ahupua'a system, that's geoengineering. To build massive irrigation, to build fish ponds, to take the entire ecosystem and to cultivate it for food production. That's just a smaller scale of geoengineering. And obviously with the kinds of, cross, fertilization, like creating and cultivating different kinds of taro, kalo, that's just a lower scale of bioengineering in some ways. But obviously the big issue there is corporatization, right?
It's a new approach then. That's your PhD is a new approach.
Right.
On how to deal with futures studies.
It's really about building those concepts, which I think are useful for people to think through. So for example, oftentimes we're so limited by the sort of language or the baggage that we have. So by creating new terms, new frameworks for thinking, you really allow people to go into new spaces. And that's why I really like global weirding. Global warming obviously is the correct scientific term for what's happening. Climate change, so people don't like that as much. But global weirding speaks to the diffuse social, ethical, political effects of this, right? It brings in the other element that isn't just there with the idea of what actually is happening at the end of the day.
And you said you're looking at 3 tech approaches people are taking: geoengineering, bioengineering. What's the third one?
The last is terraforming. So some people think that, this planet has run its course, let's boog out. It's time we finally get off this rock and just take over somewhere else. So potentially with things like colonies on Mars, or doing large-scale astroengineering, right? Getting people to live on asteroids, other sorts of things.
So these would be very long time spans that you're dealing with.
Right. So again, I mean, if you look at how the technology is being applied, Mars One put out applications for a trip to Mars, right? And received a few 100,000 applicants. I mean, I certainly don't think some of this will be happening in my lifetime. But again, because we're open to the possible and radical potentialities, it might. So thinking critically about it now hopefully gives us a framework for making sense of it when we get a little bit closer. And then what we try to always inculcate is foresight linking with policy. because it's much easier to have a policy in place moving forward than it is to have to quickly clean up the issue on the back end.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, when are you going to be finished?
It's a great question. My wife asks me the same question all the time. I am hopefully going to finish up next year, so I hopefully can get another year of funding and stick around for a little bit.
Now,
Yeah.
here's the big question. When you finish,
Right.
okay, graduate, take the PhD, what happens then?
What happens
And
then?
what does your wife say?
Right. Well, we have connections here. We have family here, so we'd like to stay here. But the realities, even though I try to take an alternative futures approach to my particular future, is that you want to go where the work is. And a lot of foresight is being done right now in Asia. So Asia, Europe is a possibility. Singapore is a hotbed activity. There's a gentleman on campus now who runs a postdoc program at Beidon, which is Peking University. So the potentiality of leaving and coming back is again, my most preferable. But I would like to stay here. In part, this is one of the few places in the world that have these conversations. And Jim Dator's 80 years old. So there's a certain intersection of the plausible and the probable there.
Plausible, probable, preferential, possible, whatever.
You got it.
So, but it sounds very academic, and whatever these matrices that you make,
Right.
However you make them, sound like that's going to be out of an academic publication of some kind. So my question is, who actually in the industry side of things or the government side of things
Right.
will put you on staff? Like tomorrow, I think it is. We have a program involving Jeff Gear. And he is a storyteller who is hired by the city and county. The city and county of Honolulu, I don't know if every county in the city in the country has one, they have a storyteller. They pay a storyteller to tell stories. So the question is, would the city and county hire a futures expert?
We would hope that they would.
They didn't yet.
They haven't yet. A number of governments do this. So Singapore, there's a prime minister level office, essentially cabinet position. Peter Ho was critical in getting foresight as part of Singapore.
Really?
We have colleagues in other countries that work a lot with government agencies. We're hoping to work with a group based in the UK to do a high level program here, specifically for government officials, corporate executives, because people are getting hip to this. Like you said, they're getting attuned to the fact this kind of thinking has practical application, right? It's not just like pie in the sky. So our work specifically tries to cross over, right? We tend not to use a lot of jargon. We tend to try to connect with, again, community organizations, individuals. So currently, Dr. Dator, myself, and another colleague, PhD candidate, Aubrey Yee, we're working on a book. And this book is based on our year-long research project about communication technologies and power, but it's written for that crossover audience. So while it has the academic research and the history, it's meant to be engaged at the undergraduate level or the public level, because we think if this research stops at the ivory tower, then what's the point? And so we like to get our hands
Who do you want
dirty.
to reach with it? You want to reach everybody.
Absolutely. I mean,
But
who's
who do
not
you want to reach
invested in the
primarily? I
future?
mean, for example, was Rasputin? Remember Rasputin?
Not personally,
in the
but-
Russian court.
Right.
And he was a very hypnotic kind of guy, and he had a lot of control of people around him. So if I'm Governor Abercrombie, and I said we have to hire a new kind of discipline here on the 5th floor of the Capitol, let's make it a future studies guy. Let's make it John A. Sweeney. Okay, come on up, John, and we want to talk to you every day about what things are doing. And you can tell us what to do. You can help us on the path to the next chapter.
Right.
Wouldn't you be too influential that way?
Well, therein lies the question, and I think you've alluded to the fact that there are immense ethical implications to doing this kind of work. So we think that there are, to use the Star Wars analogy, the Jedi and then the dark side futurists. And there are futurists out there who are more than willing to take a paycheck and not only lie to people, but to help push growth. Because at the end of the day, right? I mean, and one of the most famous futurists in the world, I would say one of the most successful futurists, is Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich was involved in the World Future Society back in the 1970s.
Using the term very loosely with him. Yeah.
Well, again, if you take the dark side analogy seriously, what did he do? He was able to envision a plan, enact it, and build his preferred future. And let's be honest, it's not my preferred future, even though I actually used to live in the county where he was in, never voted for him. But the point being is that you don't always have to be doing things that are better for everyone to sort of be a futurist. And that's the point, is people misuse
And maybe
this power.
someday these techniques will be widespread enough that people can, individuals across the state will be thinking about potential decisions and future policies and how they might affect them and futures in order to engage more.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, but your comment about Newt Gingrich is actually giving me a bit of a headache, and I'm going to take a break. So this is Jay Fidell. We're here with John A. Sweeney and Nicole Hori. We're talking about futures studies, and the title. What is the title of our show? It's something about weirding.
From global warming to global weirding.
Global warming to global weirding. We'll be right back after this break, and we'll try to recover from the thing about Newt Gingrich.
Hi, how are you? You feeling good? Are you feeling lucky? ThinkTech Hawaii, it puts a bubble in my bender. If you don't feel good, that's your fault. Now that's live TV, folks.
We're back. We're live. We're here. Nicole Hori and me, Jay Fidell, with John A. Sweeney, who is a futurist studying futures studies at UH Manoa. And I guess one of the things we'd like to know is what happens if you have a dispute over fact. If you have an issue of fact, it's hard to make great analyses going forward when you can't come to some stable assumption about what the facts are.
Right.
Like, not that it's the case now, but like climate change has been for the past 10 years, everybody disagreeing about everything.
Right.
So what do you do then?
Well, we try to differentiate between matters of fact and matters of concern. So matters of fact are always linked to, like Nicole was saying at the break, the best available data. And science is paradigmatic, which means it's always limited by the tools and instruments, the perceptions, the observations by which we get that information, right? So there's always going to be a limit, which is what I said earlier about the likeliness, the sort of like asterisk at the end of the sentence, right? Why Guy Hoggy's very clear to say it's likely that we'll have Mauka showers, right?
60% chance.
So from our perspective, the emphasis should be on matters of concern. And those are the softer, more ethical, I wouldn't say softer in the sense of their impact, but in the ethical, political issues that certainly correlate to the data, but maybe aren't a direct causation. So oftentimes, our causality isn't A to B, it's way more radical, right? It's not linear causality, it's A, then Z, then M, then Q. So we try to do lots of dynamic systems mapping to get people to think out of the box, because that data is always going to change. We're always going to get more information, hopefully better information and data. But if we can continually be concerned about the potential impacts and the radical possibilities coming out of that data, then we're doing our job.
Oh, wow. Well, what happens? What happens if nobody listens? What happens if this is all in a vacuum because they disagree with your interpretation of the basic data?
So data has what is considered to be...
Data.
Right. Data's data. Data has what he calls the laws of the future. And one of his laws is that if you're doing your job right as a futurist, you should expect initially to be ridiculed and to be called into question and to be lambasted as someone, who, like Nietzsche's madman, is out there telling people the sky is falling, the sky is falling. So actually, if we are being laughed at, we're doing our job right. And the fact that futurists are now, I'd say, widely taken more seriously than they ever have been, means that, one, either people are really attuned to changes, or it has a potentiality to get subsumed into this growth paradigm. And I think either one of those, tend to be a little more frightening because they speak to the kind of uncertainty in the world in which we live. So, it's better to live in interesting times, as the Chinese proverb says.
Is it?
Well,
So I give you a world, okay, where every government jurisdiction, every entity hires a whole group of futurists, and relies on them and asks them to answer. You put questions in through the door, you get answers out from the door. Okay, and every major corporation, with the money, does the same thing. And we are populated with people who are looking into the future for us. But they're not going to say the same thing.
Right.
They're going to disagree. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to resolve professional, even academically high-quality professional opinions about these various scenarios and what's important and what's of concern or not?
Right.
How do you resolve that?
Yeah, I'd say there is a degree of utopianism in the notion that if we had more information, if we had more data, if we were able to reify these matters of concerns, that we could end up with that perfect space. I mean, from our perspective, there are always going to be challenges just like there are always opportunities. And so what we try to, again, instill is that, and I like your metaphor of the closed door, the information. We try to open those doors. I mean, part of what we try to do is to say to people, look, sometimes preventing a future from coming into existence is just as important as creating a preferred future. Which is to say, at the end of the day, no matter how different things are and different perspectives are around the world, people tend to agree on a few common core things, right? They want to be safe. They want to have food. They want to have a place to call their own, right? They want to have a place that they feel safe and comfortable in. So they want to feel affirmed. And if we can, at the base level, meet those needs, then we can start to work out all the other stuff. But I'd say, obviously, as a civilization, we haven't even done that, right? There's a lot more work to do at the core level of those big things, and then we can work out from there. We get caught up in the minutia. We get caught up in the details, right? Washington's a great example of that. But how do we work past that? And at the very least, deal with those core sorts of things. And that's what I mentioned earlier with resiliency. I mean, we're at a potential crisis where the IPCC is saying that by the 2080s, the 1.8 to 5.2 billion people living in low-lying coastal regions are going to be at risk from things like sea level rise, extreme weather events. So I'd say at a fundamental level, how do we, one, make those people safe? And let's start there. And if we can try to get that worked out, then we can start to worry about the other stuff.
And those people are us, right?
Yeah, that's us. Absolutely. Kaimuki, my place in Kaimuki is going to be beachside property one day, potentially.
A lot of people say that. People up on the mountains in Nuanos. So, you talked about areas of concern, and you've been talking a lot about climate change. I mean, it seems to be an important thread. And do I correctly take this that your greatest area, in your analysis of all this, your greatest area of concern is climate change?
I would say that not only climate change at the level of matter of fact, but at the matter of concern, which is to say how we choose to react, even I would say presumptively react to climate change, is just as important as the changes themselves. So I mentioned, for example, geoengineering, the potential for a unilateral actor to go and to do something on their own without doing it within a governance or regulatory framework is highly plausible, which to me is even more terrifying than some of the potential changes that we're talking about. Although this last report about Honolulu's average temperature in the 2040s is pretty terrifying, right? Maybe is 10 degrees more, and certainly the recent humidity that we've had, although again, let's not equate climate and weather, shows us potentially what that world could look like, right? Yeah. So we see snapshots of this, and I think that ultimately climate change is the pressing issue of the next generation, 2, maybe 3, if we don't start to figure things out.
It's a pressing issue, but it could be like, in a societal way, it could be life and death because it has all these other implications. So, I mean, do you give that concern the same weight as the other concerns, or do you somehow say, well, no, that's the one at the front end. That's the one that governs the others. Right. And we look for how that, because it's our major concern, we look for how that affects all the other concerns and perhaps makes them irrelevant going forward.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things you try to do is you try to equate them, and this is where the whole probability, plausibility sort of dynamic comes in. Obviously, you want to look at the numbers, and if the numbers are showing you this, then you still want to obviously focus on that. And obviously, certain drivers of change have more weight and consequence than others, but you definitely don't want to call out the wild card. So what if we are able to deploy the solar shield and solar radiation is limited such that we don't have to worry about a 3-degree increase in temperature? But what if another issue becomes apparent because it dramatically affects the water cycle? So we've cut off climate change, but we've cut off our nose to spite our face because now we've created a whole other issue that no one else saw coming. So that's why we try to model those complex changes.
There's a relationship between this and science fiction, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, science fiction creates images of the future. We analyze and study and create images of the future. If you look at the work of H.G. Wells, people like J.G. Ballard, a lot of science fiction that's coming out now. I actually wrote a paper on what's called cli-fi, climate fiction, a new genre that's written specifically about climate change and how that might change social structures and phenomena. Then, yeah, it's very real. And again, we don't want to draw those lines and those disciplinary boundaries. We want to cut across them. We want to be indisciplinary in our thinking and be open to as many possible images as are out there.
Well, you know, the one thing that I'm left with, we only have a minute left to do this, but is you're talking about change.
Right.
I mean, future studies is change.
Right.
So this, the one change in neon, the one thing in neon sign is change. So how, you know, it's like stock market. You know, your stockbroker will say to you, you know, you have to rebalance every so often.
Right.
You have to adjust your portfolio to changes, you know, in the global market and so forth. How often can you afford to rebalance? How often can you afford to take all those, you know, those concerns on the matrix and re-examine them completely from the ground up? I mean, it sounds like you don't get any sleep, actually, John.
Not as much as I probably should, and my wife can probably attest to that. But you know, to speak to your point, I think it's like I told my dad, as I came out here to get a master's degree in religion. That's a degree in people. Future studies, you get a degree, you focus on change. Change is all about power, right? Who has the power to enact change? Who is affected by change? And how do you deal with those dynamics? So at the end of the day, if we can help people prepare, think critically, be aware of changes, and then hopefully work towards that preferred future where change can be mitigated and adapted to, then we're doing our job.
Wow. I used to think that nobody should be permitted to run for office unless he had a course in political science. I'm changing my view. Nobody should be permitted to run for office unless they've taken a course or two or gotten a degree in future studies. What do you think? Close, Nicole.
I think it's great. I really want to see what you're predicting for Hawaii. And I think we should actually probably come visit you and find out. I do want to talk to all the other researchers you mentioned. And I assume that, you know, with your various backgrounds, you all have different ideas. So,
Okay, more on this, John. You can run, but you can't hide.
I'll be back.
All right, you'll be back. This is ThinkTech. We've been talking to John Sweeney. He's a PhD candidate at UH Manoa in the Political Science Department, and he's a researcher in the Hawaii Research Center for Futures Studies, HRCFS. And my co-host and me, Nicole, Hori, have been having a wonderful time with him. Thank you so much,
yes.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Aloha. We'll be back.